In the wilderness, the people thirsted for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children?" The children of Israel quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" So we want to talk about the sin of complaining, begin with it. And here are 3 ways that complaining is a sin. So first, complaining is a sin when we don't recognize the good, and we just talk about the negative. So the Israelites here, they only see the hardship. They forgot God just rescued them from years of brutal slavery, and now they suffer. But suffering's just a part of human life. It's how we grow. So whenever we talk to people and we just spew out anger about everything that's wrong and we forget that there are some good things, that's the sin of complaining. Second, complaining is a sin when we blame God. They ask, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Well, of course he's among us. And none of our problems are God's fault. God doesn't do anything wrong. We talked about 2 weeks ago how world hunger is not God's fault. It's people's fault. Because the World Food Program has said for decades, there's enough food for everyone. The reason why it doesn't get to everyone, it's human corruption. So while we could ask God, "Lord, why are you allowing this?" That's a fair question. We should never ask, "Where is God?" He's always with us. It's just that the human heart is quite often far from him. Third, complaining is a sin when we don't take responsibility for our lives. So if I tell you the bad things that are going on in my life, I have to do at least 2 things. I should tell you, for example, okay, there's a tragedy in my life. I'm looking for comfort. I'm just looking for a listening ear, some support. Okay, that's not bad. Or I'm going to tell you everything that's wrong in my life right now, and I'm going to tell you how I'm going to improve. Nothing wrong with that. See, if I don't do those things, that's a sin of complaining. I'm not taking responsibility for my life. Remember what Father Jacques Philippe said. He said, ultimately, God gives us what we desire, no more, no less. So if we're not receiving his spiritual gifts, we're not receiving his gift of faith, we're not receiving his peace of soul, his strength, ultimately, that's our fault. Now let's look at today's gospel. We're going to see 3 truths. The first truth about the woman is that this woman has a lot of reasons to complain. She's had a very hard life. The text tells us that she goes to get water alone. She goes at noontime because that's the hottest part of the day. That's when no one will be there. So she's trying to avoid people. It also says that she's had 5 husbands. Now, whatever's happened there, we can only speculate, but for sure, a lot of things have gone wrong if you've had 5 husbands. So perhaps she's been abused. Perhaps she's been treated like an object. She's probably made many mistakes herself. She represents all of us. Okay, so that's the first truth. She has a lot of reasons to complain. The second truth is that Jesus is looking for her. Why? Because he wants to marry her spiritually, and because he wants to marry us spiritually. The text says, he left Judea and started back to Galilee, but he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a Samaritan city called Sychar. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. The text says he had to go through Samaria. No, he didn't. Because Jewish people at that time, since they were enemies of the Samaritans, they would always avoid it. So let's look at this map. Jesus is starting out in the south. Now, normally he would take that dotted line around Samaritan territory. They're avoiding each other. But this time it says he had to. Fascinating. He's got to go straight north into Samaritan territory. He's got to go right to Jacob's well because he's looking for this woman, because he wants that spiritual marriage. Now, how do we know that? Because 3 times in the Old Testament, whenever a foreign man, meets a woman at a well, you've got a spiritual wedding engagement. So this happens to Moses. That's how he meets his wife, Zipporah. It happens to Isaac and Rebekah. And then it happens to Jacob and Rachel. So whenever a Jewish person heard this gospel, first century Jew, they're like, oh, Jesus, he's a foreigner, going into Samaritan territory. He meets a woman at a well. You've got a spiritual engagement. They're going to get married spiritually. Now, we also know that this woman represents all of humanity because, again, 2 times in the Old Testament, God tells a certain prophet, he says, I want you to marry this woman. And that woman represents her whole people. And it says today in the gospel, Jesus is a prophet. So Jesus wants to have a spiritual marriage with all of us. So if you realize, like, Jesus is looking for you right now, 10:25 in the morning, he's looking for us, we wouldn't complain as much. But if we think, oh, God's not even around, where is he? Okay, we'll probably complain a lot more. And the third and final truth, Jesus wants to give this woman an engagement gift, a wedding gift, and that gift is freedom. He says, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. What's living water? Living water is 3 things. Either it's like a stream, water that's moving, like coming out of a fountain, or it's water that someone would wash themselves in to get ready to worship God, to get ready to worship in the temple. And then thirdly, it would be water that a bride washes in to get ready for a wedding. So Jesus wants to give this woman a spiritual gift of forgiveness of her sins, and she accepts. Now notice, she takes responsibility. When Jesus asks her to call her husband, she says, I have no husband. No complaining, no excuses, no whining. Takes responsibility. And Jesus honors that, and he says, you are right in saying I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true. So so the woman is now accepting, Jesus wants to give me a wedding gift, a wedding present. I'm going to accept it, the forgiveness of my sins. He's going to give it. Back in September, we had this video from our sister, one of our sisters here, Gail. And Gail said that for years, she had lived in a lesbian relationship. And a lot of people commented on that, saying, wow, that's really interesting. It's very, very real. And Gail said in the testimony that when she went to Musqueam Park, she was looking for a place to hang herself. And you remember what that voice said to her? The voice says, you can't do this, it's a sin. Okay, so that's Jesus speaking to her. And Gail has given me permission to share that she now talks about how Jesus is the only person in her life, the spouse of her soul. She says when Jesus spoke to her in the park, she says this, I felt with my whole being in that instance, he guided me to a truth of understanding I had never experienced before. He was mine and I was his. I've never felt such a tranquil, calm peacefulness. He is everything I need. You know what time this happened to her? Noon. Cool. And Gail, when she looks back now on her life, she sees, well, Jesus has always been there. She just didn't recognize him or resisted him. And Jesus has given her a wedding gift, 2 spiritual gifts. One, she's been able to forgive all the people who have hurt her because she's had a very hard life. And then second, the gift of not becoming proud. So we have 2 ideas to keep in mind whenever we feel like complaining. First, can we see any positive in our lives? Because God is among us. And second, are we taking responsibility for our lives? Because Jesus wants to give us a lot of gifts. Ultimately, the life we are living today is the life we have chosen. And so if we complain about parts of our life, we're complaining about what we've chosen. Jesus is among us. He is looking for us at every moment, and he is offering gifts. And our job is just to receive him.